All right, before I say anything, I want to read you something, and I want you to listen very carefully because this one sentence is going to reframe everything you think you know about what happened on July 13th. This is a direct quote from United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He said this in the weeks before July 13th when Iran began tightening its grip on the Strait of Hormuz and demanding transit fees from commercial ships. Rubio looked at the cameras and said, and I'm quoting him word for word here, "No nation may charge tolls on an international waterway. That is current international law." Okay, let that sit for a second. No nation may charge tolls on an international waterway. That is current international law. Now, July 14th, 2026, President Trump steps in front of the press and announces that the United States will impose a 20% fee on all commercial cargo passing through the Strait of Hormuz. He declares that America, and I quote again, the guardian of the Hormuz Strait. He says, and this is verbatim, "We will hold this strait and maybe we will run it." Same strait, same toll concept that Rubio said violated international law. This is not just a story about Washington hypocrisy. That would be too easy and honestly too boring. Political hypocrisy is not news. What I want to show you today is something much deeper, because that contradiction, Rubio's statement versus Trump's announcement, is not a mistake. It is not a gaffe. It is, if you know what to look for, one of the clearest signals that a superpower is entering what political theorists call the imperial thrashing phase. And once you understand what that means, you will never read a geopolitical headline the same way again. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly 3 analytical frameworks. And by the time we are done, you will understand why Trump's blockade was effectively neutralized on the same morning it was announced. Not after, not the next week, the same morning. Let's get into it. Google hypocrisy is not news. First, let me lay out the 2 events that you need to hold in your mind simultaneously, because this is fundamentally a story about 2 things happening on the same day that the entire global media is treating as unrelated. They are not unrelated. They're the same chess move seen from 2 different angles. Event number 1, on the evening of July 13th, CENTCOM, that's U.S. Central Command, announced the 3rd consecutive night of airstrikes against southern Iran. This was a 5-hour operation targeting air defense networks, coastal radar installations, missile and drone storage facilities, and military logistics in southern Iran. President Trump simultaneously announced the formal reimposition of a full naval blockade of Iran set to take effect at 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on July 14th. He proposed a 20% transit fee. The International Maritime Organization, the United Nations body that actually governs international shipping law, immediately rejected this proposal. They stated flatly that there is no legal basis for mandatory tolls on an international trade. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that Britain would not participate in enforcing the blockade. Brazil's President Lula called it, and again I'm quoting, state-sponsored piracy. Think about that. State-sponsored piracy. That's what America's allies are saying. Event number 2, the morning of that same day, July 13th, Russian Energy Minister Sergei Chivy flew to Thran. He met with Iranian Oil Minister Mohsen Paknad. Then he was taken to meet directly with President Masoud Pezeshkian. And over the course of those meetings, the 2 sides finalized the core terms of a historic long-term natural gas supply agreement. Russia will supply Iran with natural gas through Azerbaijan, starting volume 2 billion cubic meters per year, expandable to 55 billion cubic meters per year. Okay, 2 events same day. One is the United States announcing it will seal Iran off from the sea. The other is Russia handing Iran a key to a door that faces north, a door the U.S. Navy cannot touch. The global media is reporting these as 2 separate regional stories. A military escalation in one column, an energy deal in another. And that framing is, in my view, completely wrong. Not because I have a political agenda, I don't, but because it misses the entire strategic logic of what is happening. And that brings me to my first analytical framework, Thucydides. Now, I know some of you are rolling your eyes. You're thinking, Professor, stop bringing up a dead Greek guy every single time. And I understand that, but here's why I keep coming back to Thucydides. Because he was writing about something that doesn't change. Human nature doesn't change. The behavior of states doesn't change. Only the technology and the geography change. The underlying logic is always the same. Teresa, in his History of the Peloponnesian War, written around 400 BC, argued that all major actions by great powers, regardless of how they justify those actions, publicly are driven by exactly three motivations. Three. He called them fear, honor, and interest. Let's apply all three to what happened on July 13th and 14th. Fear first. The United States escalated, launched a third consecutive night of airstrikes, imposed a naval blockade, threatened Iran's nuclear sites because of fear, but not the fear of Iran per se. What Thucydides actually means by fear is what he calls relative decline. The fear of losing your position, the fear that if you show weakness now, you will be weaker permanently. America fears an Iranian nuclear weapon. America fears losing control of Middle Eastern energy routes. And underneath all of that, America fears that if it doesn't act decisively at Hormuz, China and Russia will fill that vacuum, and then the global order shifts, and then the 21st century belongs to someone else. And now here is the paradox of fear and Thucydides, and this is what makes his framework so devastatingly accurate. The more afraid a great power becomes, the more it overreaches. And the more it overreaches, the more it creates exactly the outcome it was afraid of. Look at the evidence. By July 14th, the United States had lost 39 aircraft in the Iranian theater. First 35 fighters, ABX early warning planes, Reaper drones, 39. The Pentagon's stockpile of Patriot and THAAD interceptor missiles have been so severely depleted that the Defense Department didn't have new contracts in place to replenish them fast enough. Japan was waiting on weapons deliveries from the United States and not receiving them. Germany was waiting on Typhoon missile launchers that were stuck in the pipeline, and President Trump had to authorize Ukraine to domestically manufacture Patriot missiles because the United States simply couldn't supply enough of them. A West Point analysis, I want you to notice that this is the United States Military Academy saying this warned that the Hormuz crisis was on track to strangle the American defense industrial base itself. The fear of Iranian nuclear capability led to a military campaign that depleted America's conventional deterrence capability. That is the paradox. That is what Thucydides meant. Honor second. And this one is, I think, the most important and the most misunderstood of the three motivations. The collapse of the Versailles ceasefire memorandum changed everything. On July 12th, the day before the major escalation, Trump's team spent 11 hours in negotiations with Iran. 11 hours. They got close to a deal, and then it fell apart. Iran brought new conditions at the last moment, or that's Trump's version of it. And in that moment, what drove the subsequent military response was not strategic calculation. It was honor. The fear of being seen as weak. The fear of being outsmarted. The fear of the headlines saying that Iran walked away from the table and America blinked. Trump went on Fox News and said, I'm paraphrasing now, we've had 10 deals with these people and they always break them. And then he announced a full naval blockade and called himself the guardian of the strait. You see what's happening there? That is honor talking. That is the need to reassert dominance after a perceived humiliation. That is not strategy. And Thucydides is very clear about what happens when honor becomes the primary driver. You make your worst decisions. You burn resources protecting an image instead of achieving an objective. The result? Britain refused to join the blockade. The IMO rejected the legal basis for it. Brazil called it piracy. And Trump's proposal to charge 20%, which works out to approximately $34 million for a single supertanker, was laughed off by Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, who said sarcastically that 20% is too much, and Iran would offer a fair rate. The foreign minister of the country you are blockading is publicly mocking your toll structure. That is what the pursuit of honor produces when it overrides strategic thinking, interest. Third, Trump was actually unusually candid about this. He said on Fox News that the United States had been protecting the strait for free for 50 years while other countries were making all the money. And he said it was time for America to get paid, and paid a lot. Okay, that is a statement of interest. Raw, unvarnished, honest interest. And I actually respect the candor. Most world leaders dress up interest in the language of values and norms. Trump doesn't bother. Fair enough. But here's what the theory of interest tells us. When you pursue short-term material interest by breaking the rules that you build, you destroy larger long-term interests. Because your power in the international system doesn't just come from military hardware. It comes from the fact that other countries choose to work within your system because they believe the system benefits them. The moment they stop believing that you have to use force to maintain the system, and force is always more expensive than consent. The concrete result of the interest calculation on July 13th Hormuz's shipping traffic dropped 52%, from over 100 ships per day to between 2 and 16 ships per day. 20% of the world's oil flow was disrupted. Global fertilizer, helium, and plastic supply chains fractured. Brent crude prices spiked sharply, and that inflation hit American consumers directly. Right before the midterm elections, and the 20% toll proposal generated zero compliance from any major shipping nation. 3 motivations: fear, honor, interest, all 3 active simultaneously. All 3 producing outcomes that made America's strategic position worse, not better. That is Thucydides on July 13th, 2026. Now, let me introduce the concept that is the core of today's analysis. I call it the overland bypass. This is the concept that the mainstream media has completely missed. And when you understand it, you will understand why the naval blockade was neutralized before it even went into effect. Here is the theory behind Trump's blockade. If you seal off all of Iran's southern ports, Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, Chabahar, Konarak, Kesh, Iran cannot export oil. No oil exports means no revenue. No revenue means no war. Simple enough, clean enough. And it might have worked in a world where Iran is purely dependent on maritime routes for its economic survival. Go look at a physical map of Iran right now. Iran doesn't only have a southern coastline on the Persian Gulf. Iran has a massive northern border with Azerbaijan, and Iran borders the Caspian Sea, a landlocked inland body of water that the United States Navy has zero legal or physical presence in. Zero. The overland bypass works like this. 4 steps. Step 1, Russia pumps natural gas into northern Iran through a pipeline network running through Azerbaijan. Now, and this is critical, this is not a brand new pipeline that needs to be built from scratch. The infrastructure connecting Russia, Azerbaijan, and Iran already exist. What the July 13th agreement does is commercially activated at scale. This is the difference between having a road and deciding to use it. The road was already there. Step 2, the Russian gas supplies northern Iran's industrial and domestic energy needs. The provinces in northern Iran, Tapri, Ardabi, Gilan, run in this imported Russian gas. Iran no longer needs to burn its own domestic gas reserves to power those regions. Step 3, that frees up an enormous volume of Iran's own gas from its southern fields near the Persian Gulf, which can now be redirected. Not necessarily exported by sea through the blockaded ports, but used to keep the national electricity grid running in wartime conditions and traded through the Caspian corridor northward and eastward through channels the U.S. Navy cannot intercept. Step 4, the International North-South Transport Corridor, what logistics people call the NSTC, becomes the primary alternative trade artery. Goods move from India through Iran up through Russia into Europe. The entire supply chain bypasses every U.S.-controlled maritime choke point. Okay, think about what just happened. While Trump was announcing he was locking the front door, Iran and Russia opened a back door that faces north, and they did it on the same morning. This is not a coincidence. President Peskin's own words in the meeting with Minister Shivalov confirm it. He called Russia a reliable friend and strategic partner, and explicitly urged Moscow to accelerate the implementation of shared strategic agreements, meaning the NSTC, meaning the gas swap, as a direct response to American unilateralism. The timing was deliberate, the sequencing was deliberate. While the U.S. was announcing the blockade for the evening news, Iran was signing its economic escape route over breakfast. And now let me give you the numbers that make this concrete. Number 1, 55 billion cubic meters. That is the maximum volume of the Russia-Iran gas agreement. Iran's total domestic gas consumption is approximately 230 billion cubic meters per year. At maximum expansion, this agreement covers close to 25% of Iran's entire domestic gas demand. That is significant. That is more than sufficient to restructure how Iran allocates its own domestic energy resources. Think of it as someone cutting off your water supply from the south while your northern neighbor starts piping water indirectly. The southern blockade becomes at minimum much less catastrophic. Number 2, 72 tons and 210 tons. I want you to memorize these 2 numbers because these are the numbers that explain why any serious military escalation against Iran's nuclear infrastructure is essentially being held hostage. The Bushehr nuclear power plant built by Russia's Rosatom Corporation currently contains 72 tons of fossil material and 210 tons of spent nuclear fuel on site. Rosatom's Director General, Alexei Lachov, made a public statement calling for all parties to establish what he called an island of safety around Bushehr. He explicitly warned that if this facility is struck by a bomb, intentionally or accidentally, the resulting radioactive disaster would cover multiple countries across the Middle East. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Pascal went further. He warned that any use of tactical nuclear weapons to destroy Iran's hardened underground facilities would be, quote, a catastrophic development, implying that such a move would risk pulling major powers directly into the conflict. Russia's permanent representative to international organizations in Vienna, Mail Yuanov, said flatly that any deliberate attack on an operating nuclear facility would constitute a serious international crime and trigger an ecological and radiological catastrophe affecting the entire Gulf region. Now, Russian engineers and specialists from Rosatom were scheduled to return to Bushehr in mid-July to continue construction work on new reactor units in the middle of an active war zone. Why would Russia do that? Because the presence of Russian nationals at Bushehr is itself a strategic deterrent. It is what military theorists call a tripwire. If American or Israeli strikes accidentally kill Russian engineers or trigger a radioactive release, you are no longer dealing with a US-Iran conflict. You are in a completely different category of crisis. Moscow understood this perfectly. Thrawn understood this perfectly. Washington apparently needed reminding. Number 3, $29 billion and 39 aircraft. These are the cost receipts of the American campaign so far. The Pentagon reported spending approximately $29 billion on this war, creating a $4 to $6 billion shortfall that forced the Army to cut training operations, and 39 aircraft lost in the Iranian theater, F-35s, AWACS planes, Reaper drones, and as recently as July 14th, Iran claims shooting down an additional MQ-1 drone over the Strait of Hormuz. Let me put that in perspective. Iran has been fighting the most technologically advanced military in human history on its home turf against aircraft that cost between $30 and $200 million each, and it is exchanging them for missiles and drones that cost a few thousand to a few hundred thousand per unit. That exchange ratio is catastrophically unfavorable for the United States, and it is precisely the kind of asymmetric logic that Thucydides would have recognized immediately. All right, now we get to the second big analytical framework, and this one I think is the most important for understanding the structural significance of what is happening. Not just what happened on July 13th, but why it happened and what it means for the next decade. Hegemonic stability theory. This framework was developed by 3 giants of international relations theory: Charles Kindleberger, Robert Gilpin, and Robert Keohane. Now, these 3 men disagree on quite a lot, but they all agree on the basic premise. And the premise is this: the international system, global trade, open shipping lanes, stable currencies, collective security only functions smoothly when there is one dominant power that is willing and able to provide what they call global public goods. Things like freedom of navigation, open markets, monetary stability, international security. And crucially, this is the part that matters. This dominant power provides these goods without demanding direct payment in return, because the return comes indirectly. A stable world system produces more wealth and more security for the hegemon than it costs to maintain. In the post-W World War II era, that hegemon has been the United States for 80 years. The United States Navy has patrolled the Strait of Hormuz and kept it open for global commerce, not because America is generous, but because America benefits more than anyone else from a world where that commerce flows freely. Okay? Now, on July 13th, Donald Trump formally ended that arrangement. He announced a 20% toll. He said he was tired of America paying for the security of a strait that benefits everyone else. He wanted to get paid. Kindleberger has a term for this moment. He calls it hegemonic fatigue. It is the point at which the dominant power can no longer or is no longer willing to absorb the cost of providing stability to the system. And when a hegemon stops providing public goods and starts extracting rents instead, the system begins to destabilize. Other powers stop trusting the framework. They start building parallel systems. They start cutting deals with each other that bypass the hegemog. Sound familiar? Robert Gilpin takes Kindleberger's analysis and adds a harder edge. Gilpin argues that when hegemonic fatigue sets in, the declining power doesn't just quietly step back. It uses military force to assert control, precisely because it can no longer assert control through consent and institutional legitimacy. He calls this the hegemonic thrashing phase. And the telltale sign, the clearest indicator that you're in the thrashing phase, is when the hegemon begins to violate the very rules it created. When the country that designed the rules-based international order starts breaking those rules to maintain its position. What is Marco Rubio saying about transit tolls on international waterways, that they are illegal under international law? What is Donald Trump doing 1 week later, imposing a transit toll on an international waterway? That is not hypocrisy. That is thrashing. That is a declining hegemon chewing through its own institutional credibility because it has no other lever left to pull. And Robert Keohane, who is actually the most optimistic of the three, the one who believed international institutions could outlast any individual hegemon, Hayne would say that this is the most dangerous moment because legitimacy once lost cannot be restored by force. Force accelerates the loss every time you use coercion to enforce a rule that you yourself are breaking. You make the rule weaker, not stronger. You give every other country in the world a justification to opt out of the system. You built the IMO rejection of the toll, the British refusal to join the blockade, Brazil's state piracy condemnation. These are not just diplomatic gestures. These are symptoms of hegemonic deconcentration, the technical term for when power and legitimacy begin dispersing away from the hegemon toward a multipolar distribution. Kindleberger predicted it. Gilpin mapped the stages. Kane warned us what it would look like from the inside. We are watching it live. Now, I always do this before I give you my conclusion. I want to present the strongest possible argument for the opposing side because I think you deserve to engage with the real debate, not a caricature of it. Here is the best case for Trump's blockade strategy. The overland bypass you describe is theoretical. The Russia-Iran-Azerbaijan gas pipeline at full commercial scale doesn't exist yet. The July 13th agreement is a term sheet, not an operating pipeline. Building or expanding the infrastructure to 55 billion cubic meters per year will take years. And in the interim, in the 6, 12, 18 months before that infrastructure is fully operational, a sustained U.S. naval blockade combined with continued economic pressure could squeeze Iran's export revenues enough to force them back to the negotiating table on American terms. This approach has historical precedent. Economic sanctions and naval pressure have worked against smaller states in the past. And the U.S. Navy, with over 50,000 personnel currently deployed in the Middle East, theater remains the most powerful maritime force in human history. The theory is sound. That is the Steelman argument. And I want to be honest, it is not completely without merit, but here is why it fails. 2 specific reasons. Reason 1, the pipeline does not need to be built from scratch. This is the factual error at the heart of the optimistic American assessment. The infrastructure connecting Russia, Azerbaijan, and northern Iran already exists. It is not at the capacity of 55 billion cubic meters per year. That is the expansion target. But the initial 2 billion cubic meters per year that is achievable now through existing infrastructure, through what energy traders call a gas swap arrangement. Russia injects gas into the northern end of the Iranian grid through existing connections. Iran balances by adjusting its own southern production and redirecting domestic supply flows. You don't need to lay new pipe for the initial phase. The road already exists. July 13th was a decision to use it, not the decision to build it. And once the swap mechanism is commercially active, once there is a financial and logistical routine in place, scaling it up is an engineering problem, not a from-scratch construction problem. It takes months, not years. And every month that passes, the overland bypass becomes more entrenched, more commercially valuable, and harder to disrupt. Reason 2, Bushehr is a hard ceiling. I already gave you the numbers. 72 tons of fissile material, 210 tons of spent nuclear fuel, Russian engineers on site. Any military scenario in which the U.S. maximum pressure campaign reaches its logical conclusion, meaning direct strikes on Iran's nuclear and energy infrastructure, runs directly into the Bushehr tripwire. You cannot bomb Iran into submission without eventually threatening Bushehr. And threatening Bushehr means threatening a radioactive disaster that would affect Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, every Gulf state that the United States is supposed to be protecting. It means threatening the livelihoods of Russian nationals. And it means risking a direct escalation path with a nuclear-armed state that has explicitly warned of catastrophic consequences. The blockade has a ceiling. The overland bypass lowers the floor of what the blockade can achieve. Together, those 2 constraints mean the strategic logic of maximum pressure through naval blockade does not work in the current environment. That's not an opinion. That's geography and physics. All right, we're coming to the end. Let me give you 3 specific things to watch in the next 72 hours. First, Foreign Minister Lavou's visit to Thrawn. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed on July 13th that a visit by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Tran is being planned. When Lavrov lands in Tran, watch the language in the joint commune very carefully. Right now, Russia's commitment to Iran is primarily economic. The gas deal, the NSTC, Rostom's presence at Bushehr. If Lavou's visit produces language around security guarantees, political backing, or defense cooperation, that is a fundamental upgrade. That is Russia moving from energy partner to strategic guarantor. That changes the entire calculus. Second, India's response. This matters more than most analysts are saying right now. An Indian national was killed when Iran struck the UAE tankers Mombasa and Al-Bahaya in Omani territorial waters. New Delhi is in an extraordinarily difficult position. They have a strategic partnership with the United States. They are also the primary beneficiary of the NATC corridor running through Iran. They are buying discounted Russian oil, and now one of their citizens is dead in an Iranian strike. How India responds, whether it condemns Iran sharply, whether it stays quiet, whether it tries to mediate, will tell you a great deal about which way the global south is leaning in this conflict. India cannot straddle both sides indefinitely. Third, Brent crude and the $100 threshold. Every day that crude stays above $100 per barrel is another day that countries producing oil outside the Persian Gulf are generating enormous windfall revenue. Every day the blockade continues without breaking, Iran's resistance is another data point that the strategy is failing. And every spike in gasoline and food prices inside the United States is a domestic political cost that compounds heading into the midterms. Trump is betting that the pressure on Iran will crack before the pressure on American voters does. Watch the oil price. It is telling you every single day which side is winning that bet. Your homework for this week, I want you to do 3 things. 1, go find the official map of the International North-South Transport Corridor. Look at where it runs. Look at what ports it uses. And then look at where the U.S. naval blockade can and cannot reach. The geography will tell you everything I just told you in a single image. 2, find the original Rubio statement about transit tolls on international waterways. Read it. Then read Trump's July 13th announcement. Put them side by side and then ask yourself, is this a contradiction or is it a signal? I would argue it is a signal. A signal that the rules-based order, at least as administered by Washington, is no longer operating on consistent principles. And if it's not consistent, it's not really a rules-based order. It's just power with good PR. 3, write about the Peloponnesian War. I know, Professor, not the Greeks again, but specifically write about what happened to Athens after the Sicilian expedition, when Athens, at the peak of its power, launched an overwhelming military campaign against a smaller adversary, overextended its resources, and triggered a cascade of strategic failures that ultimately ended Athenian hegemony. Not because Syracuse was stronger than Athens, but because Athens stopped thinking strategically and started acting on fear, honor, and short-term interest. Thucydides wrote that history 2,400 years ago as a warning. It remains, in my view, the most relevant thing you can read to understand what is happening in the Persian Gulf right now. One final thought. Kindleberger argued that the Great Depression of the 1930s happened not because any single country was malicious, but because the declining hegemon Britain could no longer afford to provide global public goods, and the rising power, the United States, was not YTW liked. In that gap between the old order and the new one, the world economy collapsed. We may be in an analogous moment today, not with economics, but with security. The United States is signaling loudly and clearly that it is no longer willing to provide freedom of navigation as a free public good. The alternative powers, Russia, China, the ISTC coalition, are not yet capable of providing a coherent replacement system. And in that gap, you get exactly what we are seeing. Ships diverted, supply chains fractured, commodity prices spiking, small nations caught between competing great powers with no safe harbor. This is not a story about Trump being reckless, and it is not a story about Iran being defiant. Those are the headlines. The actual story is about a structural transition in the international order that has been building for 20 years and is now accelerating in real time. And here is the question I want to leave you with. Think about it carefully before ETBUE. Marco Rubio said, no nation may charge tolls on an international waterway. That is international law. 1 week later, the nation he represents charged 20%. So here's the question. When the power that wrote the rules breaks the rules, what happens to the rules? And what happens next to the power? Thucydides answered that question. Kindleberger answered that question. Gilpin answered that question. Cohen answered that question. They all answered it differently, but they all agreed on one thing. The answer is not good for the rule breaker. I'll see you next time.